I can't imagine how many trade paperback sales of Preacher there have been, but I know they're enough to say, if the character wants to f*** a chicken, he can f*** a chicken.
Better let him f*** a chicken.
I want to talk about Marvel Knights first because we're celebrating the 20th anniversary of that imprint, which really shook things up in Marvel. And back when you were brought on to do the Punisher, you actually had to wait a year.
That's right. That was why you got the sort of Ghostbuster Punisher that went first. So
Guardian Angel Punisher?
That's the one, which, as I recall, sold pretty well anyway. I think because people just wanted the Punisher. So it was maybe a nice way to test the waters. And of course, when Stephen, my book, came out, people went crazy for it because it was the Punisher they wanted. And I think the character had sort of slipped off the radar for a year or two anyway.
Yeah, he went through that explosion in the late 80s, early 90s.
Right.
Where he had like 3 books. And then as the industry imploded, so did the character.
Yeah.
You and Steve come on board. And what I loved about that run was that you didn't even try to justify his behavior.
No.
Because Frank Castle is, let's face it, a homicidal maniac. And your series didn't tiptoe around it, kind of embraced that.
Yeah, it did. At that point, in the end of the 90s, I didn't see any particular reason to treat the concept, the character, with any real degree of seriousness. I mean, it was a simpler time. The world had yet to take that turn into the dark it took early in this century. And at the end of the last, it was easy to write a book about a violent character and simply treat it as a ridiculous, ludicrous concept that could almost be played for laughs, and which we frequently did. Although I don't regard the Marvel Knights Punisher as being really as good as the Max Punisher work that I did, as being as worthwhile, I have realized how important it was to me and my career. A lot of people talk about Preacher, but it barely sold half what that Punisher run did. And all of a sudden, I realized what this did for me was it got my work in front of a mainstream Marvel audience who might never go anywhere near something like Preacher.
You and Steve spent years on Preacher, then you're working on Punisher. How did you and Steve work together on it?
We worked together very, very simply. We almost never talked about work. There was almost no creative interaction. I know that sounds odd, people are surprised, but each of us simply trusted the other to get on with the job. I would supply him with scripts that kept him entertained, and I wouldn't ask him for the impossible. And he would give me good artwork that told the story exactly the way I wanted it, and that's all it took. In the 25 years I knew him, we almost never talked about what we were doing at that particular time. We talked about anything else but.
That's fascinating.
Sometimes he would ask me, just out of interest, what was coming up, what would happen to this character. But it wasn't because he was preparing himself to draw it. He was just interested. As he always said, give me a good story. And that was why he was interested. He wanted to know if the story would continue the way it was going. Would it be good? Would it give him what he wanted? There was never any, can you redraw this? There was never any, you'll need to rewrite this sequence because I can't. That never happened. It was really just a kind of what we call telepathy and trust. Once we met, became friends, and kind of clicked creatively, I don't think there was any need for any interaction after that. It's one of the reasons I was enormously fortunate to know him and work with him.
There's only a few teams, creative teams, that really become locked at the hip. In the modern comics era, your name and Steve Dillon's are right there. Is that just one of those once-in-a-lifetime situations where you find the right artist who's not only the perfect artist to complement your writing, but also somebody that you're friends with that makes the whole process easier?
I think you might say that myself and Steve would perhaps be the purest expression of that, of what you're talking about. But there are others. John McCrae on Hitman, for instance, he and I were good friends, still are, right throughout our time working together. I would say it was a relationship not unlike that I enjoyed, the one that I enjoyed with Steve. Other people that come to mind would be Russ Braun, Jason Burrows, Carlos Esquerra. In none of these cases was that expression I'm talking about perhaps as pure as what Steve and I enjoyed creatively, but it's definitely along the same lines.
Is it true that he could pencil 5 pages in a day?
Oh, he could do more than that. But the interesting thing about the Punisher...
Could Jimmy Palmiotti keep up as the inker?
Jimmy could keep up with him, really. He's one of the few who could. But Steve pointed out to me that, in a way, penciling for an inker slowed him down, because when you saw his pencils for his own inks, they were basically stick figures. He did all the work in the inks. If he had the pencil for another inker, he was doing all the work that normally he would do in the ink, so no time was saved. Not really.
You were an avowed non-superhero fan.
That's
so what
right.
comics were you reading as a kid?
Well, I lived in a small town outside Belfast in Northern Ireland, and the distribution was such that all we got were the mainstream British titles. We didn't even get the British reprints of the Marvel books. We certainly didn't get the original Marvel and DC books, which would show up in British stores occasionally. I'm talking here in the days before comic shops, of course. I'm talking about corner stores.
Pharmacies,
exactly.
things like that.
So I had almost no experience of American comics at all. And when I did see them, they didn't compare favorably with what I was reading. 2000 AD, another comic called Action, another one, a war comic called Battle. These were British weekly anthologies. They featured a lot of very straightforward, bare-bones storytelling. Judge Dredd is, of course, the best example. A character who was conceived as a future cop who would shoot people for dropping litter, if it came to it. When I saw, and I did occasionally see things like Batman and Spider-Man, I just didn't see the point of them at all. Next to something like Judge Dredd, I saw what I think of as a kind of Stan Lee storytelling, where a fight will go on over several pages, coming off more like a dance than anything else, in which these characters will exchange reams of dialogue. They'll cover the page in dialogue while hitting each other. And in comparison to what I was reading, that just didn't work for me. And so when I moved into writing comics myself, I had no superhero tradition, no affection for superheroes to bring with me. And I think you do have to encounter them and like them as a kid for them to work for you as an adult.
Sure, to understand the good things about the characters and also the flaws to try to improve them, right?
Kids' affection.
You're very atypical in the comic book field. You obviously know that.
Yeah, I feel like I was lucky. I feel like I dodged a bullet in a way there, because if I hadn't, I'd have nothing original to say. There'd be nothing there'd be no point of view I could claim as purely my own. I can remember one publisher saying to me that his problem was that every time he gave Superman to a writer, that writer became the 5-year-old, eventually became the 5-year-old he was when he first encountered Superman, full of awe and wonder at the character. And he wanted me to write it because he thought that with that being lacking, I would do something a lot more hard-edged. He was wrong about that, actually. But I think that nicely communicates the idea. If you don't have that childhood affection for these characters, they'll mean nothing to you. You encounter them as an adult, which I did sort of in my late teens, and you'll come at them from a completely different angle. They'll mean either nothing, or all you'll be able to do is see the funny side, the ridiculous side.
Hellblazer was your introduction to American comic book fans, and you followed the toughest act to follow in comics, Alan Moore.
I didn't exactly follow Alan. I followed Alan via Jamie Delano, who,
right,
while Alan created the character in Swamp Thing, Jamie did the first 40 issues of Hellblazer, which was Constantine in his own book. I followed Jamie, and I thought Jamie set the tone very nicely for the character, because he took Constantine out of a superhero universe and put him in a much darker, more hard-edged world.
And you ran with that and took him in your direction.
I did. I realized or understood that was where Constantine belonged. To me, he doesn't work in a superhero world, or if he does, only on the edge of it. Clearly DC disagree.
There's still a great amount of affection and reverence for your time on the character, so clearly a lot of fans agree with your take on it. From there, you then went to the big break, Preacher. Tell me about pitching Preacher to Karen Berger.
It was really done to Stuart Moore, who was the editor of Hellblazer at the time and who had worked on the book with myself and Steve.
So you pitched it to Stuart first.
Yeah, DC, through Stuart, essentially said, we love what you did on Hellblazer, we'll take whatever you two want to do next. And Preacher was what I came up with. It did not spring fully formed. I can tell you that. It was a series of ideas, one slowly building upon the next, something of a jumble, where I proceeded largely on instinct, slowly understanding that I was onto something here, that the southern-western feel that the thing had was the way to go, the kind of American Gothic feel. Working my way through stories, thinking, shall we put the kid in the coffin? Shall we put the little kid in the coffin? Let's put the little kid in the coffin and say, that's weird, I haven't heard of anyone doing that before. Let's see what happens with that. And the more I did, the more it seemed to work. So it wasn't really as organic a book in its development as some of the things I would do later, like The Boys, like Hitman, like my runs on The Punisher, which I think perhaps are a little bit more accessible. Preacher is perhaps accessible for people in a different way, where if you've got the right sensibility, the right sense of humor, you'll see all this stuff being flung at you, and you'll perhaps be a little overwhelmed at first, but you'll understand on some basic level, yeah, I'll go with it.
Can you pinpoint when you felt, okay, now I've got a handle on the story that I want to tell for the remainder of the time on Preacher?
Would have been towards the end of the second year, when I was writing sort of 2021, 22, realizing, oh, I know where it goes. I know how it finishes. I know how to tie this together. There was still a lot of blank space in between that I could fill in, but that was around the point where I started to see, yes, I know what happens with the Saint of Killers. I know how Jesse and Cassidy resolve all this. I see it. It was really just, once again, accepting that I was writing a Western.
Vertigo was created to give creators like yourself free reign, right, to do. Did you get pushback for characters like DC or R-Space?
No, not as
Come on, you didn't get pushback on that?
Where we got pushback was more for specific incidents. R-Space did not cause a problem at the time. That was strange. It would be more a line of dialogue. It would be more a specific scene. I can recall being told years later that the publisher did not actually look at Preacher for the first 2 years. The impression I got was he hadn't bothered until he heard that one of Karen's funny little books was making a bit of an impact, so should check it out. So he got the first 2 trades and started reading them. And I'm told that someone wandered into his office the next day and noticed there was a hole in the ceiling and said, what gives? And he said, I've never done that before. I threw a book at the ceiling. Now, I don't know what scene it was. It's the second book, so you can guess. But that was probably how we got away with so much in those first couple of years, because no one senior enough was looking and taking offense. That would not always be the case, but that might have helped us. That might have been what got us through those first difficult 2 years. And at that point, of course, the publisher has to look at it and go, well, I hate this with every fiber of my being, but look at this big stack of cash it's earned. So,
because by then, Preacher was, like Sandman, becoming a very popular trade paperback seller.
Right, exactly.
Which is something that Vertigo really introduced into the industry.
That's right.
And I can't imagine how many trade paperback sales of Preacher there have been, but I know they're enough to say, the character wants to f*** a chicken, he can f*** a chicken.
Better let him f*** a chicken.
And that is from Paul Levitz himself. He said that. He said the one question.
Did he actually use those words?
Oh, He told me this verbatim. He goes, the one question I did ask Karen was in a meeting, and he did kind of say the same thing that he purposely did not read the Vertigo books to give you guys space. But he says, Karen, does he really have to f*** a chicken?
Well, maybe that's knocked my respect for Paul up a notch. Yeah.
Faith is a common theme across a great many of your books. Even in The Punisher, you see it. As someone who's an avowed atheist, why is that such an important theme for you to explore?
I suppose it comes from my fascination with religion and its effect on the world as a largely negative force. I grew up in a country that it was really cut in half by a religious division. Looking at the history of what Christianity in particular has done to the Western world over the centuries, it's a fascination. There's a degree of disgust there. It's something that's never going to go away from my work, I think, because these ideas seem to be so strong and they exert such an influence over so many. And on another level, you get some great toys to play with. You get demons and angels, and you get blasphemy. You get a lot of great special effects, a lot of great characters and background material, things that can liven up any story.
Send it on this. If Garth Ennis is still reading comics, give me 3 comics that he's reading now.
I'm reading Saga. I shouldn't be, because it's about elves in space, but it's Brian K. Vaughan, so it's just so good. Anything Alan Moore does. I thought Providence was quite incredible. I've never seen anyone manage to think beyond human in the way that Alan did when he was writing that book. Think beyond and outside human morality in quite a scary way, quite a disturbing way. But given that the world of H.P. Lovecraft revolves around entities that regard human beings as bugs, if they regard them at all, I think that's more than appropriate, and he really caught that. And beyond that, hell, you've got me. That's it for the moment.
Those 2, I'm shocked that Saga's on the list.
It shouldn't be, but he's so good. I mean, it's Brian Vaughan.